For most of human history, climate has never been calm or predictable. Long before agriculture, cities, or written records, our ancestors lived under skies that constantly shifted, temperatures that rarely settled, and landscapes that could change within a single lifetime. Yet even within this context of instability, there were moments when environmental pressure went far beyond anything considered normal. One of those moments unfolded near the end of the Pleistocene, when Earth entered a prolonged state of climatic chaos that lasted close to 20 consecutive years. This was not a single catastrophic event, not a sudden disaster that struck and passed. It was a sustained breakdown of the planet's climate systems, a period when storms became the dominant condition rather than isolated occurrences. Atmospheric patterns failed to reset. Weather systems overlapped, collided, and intensified instead of dispersing. In many regions, rain fell almost continuously, while others were battered by relentless winds that stripped the land of fertile soil. What emerged was a world locked in imbalance. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you're enjoying the content, hit subscribe. It really helps the channel. And to everyone already subscribed and following Primal Roots, thank you for the support. The evidence for this episode does not come from one source alone. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve unusual layers packed with fine particles, signaling repeated atmospheric disturbances and intense storm activity. Ocean sediments reveal abrupt chemical shifts, pointing to major disruptions in marine circulation. On land, erosion patterns show cycles far more aggressive than normal, shaped by persistent rainfall and high-energy winds. Together, these records tell a consistent story. The planet entered a state of prolonged climatic stress, unlike anything seen in surrounding periods. What makes this interval so exceptional is its duration. Even during ice ages, extreme weather tends to arrive in pulses. Here, instability became continuous. Cold fronts followed one another without clear seasonal breaks. Regions that had once supported predictable ecosystems were pushed beyond their capacity to recover. Forests thinned and retreated. Flooded plains replaced open hunting grounds. Entire landscapes lost their familiar structure within just a few years. The underlying causes remain debated, but the most widely supported models point to a convergence of powerful forces. Sudden disruptions in ocean circulation weakened the transfer of heat from the equator to higher latitudes, cooling vast regions rapidly. At the same time, increased volcanic activity likely injected large quantities of aerosols into the atmosphere, reducing incoming solar radiation. Orbital variations amplified these effects, pushing Earth's climate past a threshold where normal feedback mechanisms could no longer restore balance. As the years passed, the ecological consequences became increasingly visible. Large herbivores already sensitive to environmental shifts struggled to adapt to rapidly changing vegetation and flooded terrains. Migration routes that had functioned for generations no longer provided reliable resources. As prey populations declined or vanished locally, predators followed. Each collapse triggered another, unraveling food webs across entire continents. For human groups, the impact was immediate and severe. These populations were small, highly mobile, and deeply dependent on environmental regularity. Survival strategies relied on seasonal knowledge, when animals moved, when plants produced food, where water could be found year after year. When those patterns disappeared, experience accumulated over thousands of years suddenly lost much of its value. Archaeological sites from this period tell a story of constant displacement. Camps were abandoned more frequently, often in haste. Stone tools left behind show little sign of reuse, suggesting sudden departures with no expectation of return. Skeletal remains display markers of prolonged nutritional stress, particularly among children and older individuals. Infant mortality rose sharply, limiting the ability of populations to recover even during brief moments of relief. Beyond food scarcity, the environment itself became a persistent threat. Cold, moisture, and wind increased exposure-related illnesses. Fine airborne particles irritated lungs and weakened respiratory systems. Shelters collapsed as soil eroded or slopes failed. Infections that might once have been survivable became lethal in bodies already compromised by hunger and exhaustion. Over time, population fragmentation became unavoidable. Groups were separated by expanding wetlands, unstable terrain, and regions rendered uninhabitable. This isolation reduced genetic exchange and cultural transmission, creating small, vulnerable pockets of humanity. In such conditions, a single harsh winter, disease outbreak, or failed foraging season could erase an entire group without leaving descendants. Modern genetic studies quietly echo this ancient crisis. The relatively low genetic diversity of today's human population suggests a severe bottleneck, a period when the number of breeding individuals dropped to astonishingly low levels. While multiple factors likely contributed, the timing aligns closely with this prolonged phase of climatic instability, making the connection difficult to ignore. Yet this chapter of near collapse was not defined solely by loss. Within the pressure of constant uncertainty, adaptive responses began to emerge. Tools became more versatile. Diets expanded to include resources once considered marginal. Food sharing grew increasingly important, reducing individual risk in unpredictable conditions. These changes did not eliminate danger, but they improved the odds of survival in a world that no longer offered stability. As the 20th year approached, subtle signs of change appeared. Ocean currents slowly reorganized. Volcanic activity declined. The atmosphere began to clear. Storms weakened, not suddenly but gradually. When relative stability returned, the planet that emerged was fundamentally altered. Ecosystems had shifted, species had disappeared, and humanity carried the biological imprint of a near-extinction event within its own genetic structure. This prolonged storm was not just an environmental crisis. It was a turning point that reshaped the trajectory of human survival. What followed would determine not only who endured, but how the survivors would adapt, cooperate, and ultimately redefine what it meant to be human. As the prolonged storm settled into a new normal, survival ceased to be guided by expectation and became a matter of constant urgency. The world no longer offered reliable signals. Seasonal rhythms blurred, ecological boundaries dissolved, and familiar landscapes transformed into hostile terrain within a few years. In this unstable environment, persistence depended less on tradition and more on rapid adjustment to conditions that changed faster than experience could predict. The environmental collapse unfolded unevenly across the planet. Some regions endured near continuous rainfall that saturated soils and prevented the regeneration of edible plants. Elsewhere, relentless winds scoured the land, stripping away entire layers of fertile ground. Coastal zones faced rising waters and shifting currents that sharply reduced marine productivity. Regardless of location, biological output declined abruptly, shrinking the energy available to all forms of life. Large animals were among the first casualties. Already stressed by earlier climatic fluctuations, megafauna could not keep pace with the speed and scale of environmental transformation. Traditional migration routes failed as vegetation patterns shifted or disappeared. Populations fragmented, then collapsed. Predators followed soon after, further destabilizing ecosystems. For humans, this meant the gradual loss of dependable, high-calorie prey that had supported survival for generations. Faced with this reality, food strategies had to change. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a marked expansion in dietary range. Resources once considered secondary became essential. Deep roots, tubers, insects, shellfish, small vertebrates, and hardy plant species moved to the center of subsistence strategies. This shift demanded new knowledge, longer foraging times, and more careful processing to extract sufficient nutrition from low-yield foods. Technological change during this phase was subtle but meaningful. Toolkits became more flexible, favoring multi-purpose implements over specialized forms. This reduced the burden of transport as groups moved more frequently. Local materials were used with increasing creativity, compensating for limited access to traditional stone sources. These adaptations did not represent technological leaps, but they significantly improved efficiency under extreme constraints. Mobility became a near-constant condition. Camps were temporary by necessity, designed to be assembled and abandoned quickly. Lightweight shelters replaced more stable constructions. While this reduced prolonged exposure to degraded environments, it also limited storage, planning, and long-term resource accumulation. The energetic cost of continuous movement weighed heavily on the most vulnerable: children, pregnant individuals, and the elderly. Social structures adapted under pressure. Small isolated groups faced greater risk, while temporary aggregation offered clear advantages. Food sharing evolved from a cooperative choice into a survival requirement. Evidence suggests that social rules governing distribution became more formalized, reducing internal conflict when resources were scarce. Groups that failed to manage sharing effectively were less likely to persist. At the same time, isolation between populations intensified. Expanding wetlands, unstable landscapes, and zones of persistent climatic stress fractured habitable territory. Contact between distant groups became rare. Cultural exchange slowed. Genetic mixing declined. In this fragmented world, resilience depended increasingly on local conditions and internal cohesion rather than broader networks. The consequences of isolation were severe. In small populations, random events carried disproportionate weight. A disease outbreak, an unusually harsh season, or a failed foraging strategy could lead to complete local extinction. Without external connections, recovery was often impossible. This pattern helps explain why many human groups vanished without leaving direct descendants. Genetic evidence reinforces this interpretation. Certain regions of the human genome display reduced variability, indicating that only a limited subset of populations survived this interval. The bottleneck was not uniform, but it was deep enough to leave a lasting signature. The survivors did not represent the full diversity of earlier humanity. They were shaped by chance, resilience, and adaptation under extreme pressure. Physiological stress compounded these challenges. Prolonged exposure to cold, moisture, and poor nutrition weakened immune defenses. Respiratory infections became more frequent. Waterborne diseases spread in flooded environments. Minor injuries, once manageable, became serious threats in bodies already pushed to their limits. Survival increasingly favored those with greater tolerance for stress and more efficient energy use. Yet the human response was not purely reactive. Innovation emerged within constraint. The transmission of knowledge became critical. Effective foraging techniques, food processing methods, and shelter construction needed to be learned quickly and remembered accurately. Groups that failed to preserve and share reliable information were less likely to endure. There are indications that symbolic communication gained importance during this time. Marks, objects, and visual patterns may have served as tools for conveying information in environments where direct contact was infrequent. While still debated, this possibility suggests that climatic pressure may have accelerated key aspects of human cognition and communication. As years of instability continued, environmental stress began to shape biology itself. Individuals with more efficient metabolisms, greater behavioral flexibility, and higher stress tolerance gained survival advantages. Natural selection operated quietly but persistently, favoring traits that supported endurance in unpredictable conditions rather than specialization in stable ones. By the time early signs of climatic stabilization appeared, many populations were already gone. Those that remained were fewer in number, but carried adaptations forged by prolonged adversity. The world around them was beginning to reorganize, yet the imprint of the crisis was embedded in both landscape and lineage. The prolonged storm had transformed survival into a constant negotiation with uncertainty. It dismantled familiar ecological relationships and forced humanity into a narrower path. But within that narrowing, it also refined the qualities that would define the species moving forward: flexibility, cooperation, and the capacity to learn under pressure. What emerged from this period was not a return to an earlier way of life, but a restructured humanity, shaped by scarcity and instability. The environment was slowly recovering, but the consequences of this near collapse were far from over. In the next chapter, the deeper legacy of this crisis would become clear, revealing how a brief interval in geological time permanently altered the evolutionary trajectory of our species. When the sequence of storms finally weakened, the planet did not return to its former state. Climatic stabilization unfolded slowly and unevenly, reshaping the world in ways that would persist long after the skies cleared. Some regions began to recover within a few generations, while others remained degraded for centuries. River systems shifted course, flooded lowlands solidified into permanent wetlands, and landscapes that once supported dense ecosystems never fully regained their former productivity. The environment that emerged was not restored, but reconfigured. For the human populations that endured, the end of continuous instability did not bring immediate relief. Survivors were few, scattered, and carried the cumulative consequences of years spent under extreme environmental pressure. Population recovery was slow, constrained not only by limited resources, but also by biological stress embedded during the crisis. Growth depended on fragile ecosystems that could support life only intermittently. The demographic collapse left a distinct imprint on the human genome. Genetic studies indicate a sharp reduction in variability, consistent with a severe population bottleneck. Entire lineages disappeared, while others persisted largely by chance. The resulting population was smaller, more homogeneous, and profoundly shaped by selection acting under harsh conditions. This was not merely survival of the strongest, but of those best suited to uncertainty. Selective pressures favored efficiency over abundance. Metabolisms capable of extracting energy from diverse and low-quality food sources offered clear advantages. Physiological tolerance to cold, dampness, and nutritional stress increased survival odds. Stress response systems that balanced endurance and recovery became more effective. These traits did not emerge suddenly, but the prolonged crisis amplified their importance, embedding them more deeply within the population. The impact extended beyond biology. The experience of long-term instability altered the way humans interacted with their surroundings. Dependence on narrow, predictable resource bases became untenable. Instead, a flexible relationship with the environment took hold, built on dietary diversity, strategic mobility, and constant environmental assessment. Survival required attention to subtle changes rather than reliance on fixed patterns. Cooperation solidified as a central element of human persistence. Groups that maintained strong internal cohesion and effective resource sharing were more likely to endure periods of scarcity. Social systems evolved not as abstract structures, but as functional responses to extreme pressure. Trust, reciprocity, and collective risk management became essential traits at the population level. Cultural transmission gained equal importance to genetic inheritance. Knowledge related to food processing, shelter construction, and environmental interpretation needed to be preserved with precision. Errors carried high costs. Learning became faster, more selective, and more conservative, favoring practices proven to work under variable conditions. The ability to store, recall, and transmit information reliably became a decisive survival factor. There is growing evidence that cognitive adaptations were reinforced during this phase. Navigating unpredictable landscapes favored enhanced spatial memory and situational awareness. Anticipating risk in unstable environments encouraged planning and decision-making under uncertainty. Communication methods capable of conveying complex information efficiently became increasingly valuable, shaping the foundations of later symbolic behavior. As climatic conditions stabilized, new opportunities emerged, but they were uneven and often temporary. Recolonizing previously uninhabitable regions required caution and accumulated knowledge. Survivors approached these landscapes with strategies shaped by recent experience, emphasizing flexibility over permanence. The ability to abandon a location when conditions worsened became as important as the ability to exploit it when resources were available. The populations that expanded during this phase carried with them a refined adaptive toolkit. They were less numerous than their predecessors, but more resilient. Their strategies were not optimized for abundance, but for persistence across variable conditions. This shift would define human success in the millennia that followed. The legacy of the prolonged storm did not fade with time. Subsequent generations inherited both a transformed environment and a set of behavioral tendencies shaped by crisis. Humanity became increasingly capable of occupying a wide range of habitats, from dense forests to arid zones and colder regions. The experience of near collapse appears to have filtered out overly specialized survival strategies, favoring generalists able to adjust quickly. The planet itself continued to change. Ecosystems reorganized, new equilibria formed, and biodiversity recovered slowly. Some losses were permanent. Certain species never returned, and some landscapes were irreversibly altered. The balance that preceded the storm was not restored, but replaced by a new configuration shaped by disruption and adaptation. This event left no monuments, no written records, and no obvious archaeological signatures that immediately reveal its scale. Its traces persist instead in ice layers, sediment cores, fossil assemblages, and in the structure of the human genome. It was a planetary crisis recorded not in stone but in survival itself. Human continuity through this interval was not the result of dominance or technological superiority. It depended on behavioral flexibility, social cohesion, and the capacity to adapt under relentless pressure. In an environment defined by instability, these qualities outweighed strength, size, or specialization. The silent transformation that occurred during this period helps explain many features of modern humanity. Cultural diversity, mobility, innovation, and sensitivity to environmental change all reflect a species shaped by repeated encounters with uncertainty. The storm did not merely threaten human existence, it refined the mechanisms that allowed it to continue. The evolutionary path that followed was not inevitable. It was narrowed by loss and shaped by survival under extreme constraint. Every subsequent expansion, migration, and cultural development occurred within boundaries set by this earlier crisis. The human species that emerged was different from the one that entered the storm, less diverse, but more adaptable. In this sense, humanity did not overcome the prolonged climatic collapse. It was reshaped by it. The pressures of that interval carved a deeper resilience into the species, one rooted in cooperation, learning, and flexibility rather than dominance. These traits became the foundation upon which later complexity was built. The storm that lasted nearly 20 years marked one of the most critical moments in human history, not because it was visible or dramatic in the archaeological record, but because of what it removed and what it left behind. It stripped humanity to its essentials and in doing so, set the conditions for everything that followed. The echoes of that distant crisis remain present today, embedded in human biology and behavior. They serve as a reminder that survival has often depended less on control over the environment than on the ability to adapt when control is impossible. Humanity's continued existence is, in part, the legacy of a world that once came close to moving on without it. If you want to explore more moments when humanity stood at the edge of extinction and understand how extreme environments shaped who we are today, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. New episodes dive deeper into the hidden forces that forged human evolution.